In 2020, game developer MiHoYo risked everything financially to create Genshin Impact, and well, we all know that saying the game had a successful launch would be an understatement. One breakout success can be attributed to circumstance, but two makes it a pattern. And so, Hoyo proved that they were able to create another massive hit with the release of Honkai Star Rail in 2023. At this point, it seemed like they had truly cracked the code, and with their levels of ideas and execution, any project they saw through to release would become an instant global phenomenon. Slated to come out in 2024, Hoyo's next game, Zenless Zone Zero, appeared like it would be no different. Keeping the same level of quality that we were used to by this point, with somehow even more visual polish, featuring fast-paced action gameplay in an urban environment, and yeah, people were excited. So on July 4th, 2024, the game was released publicly worldwide, and there were plenty who instantly fell in love with the game, but also just as many who felt like Zenless Zone Zero simply didn't click with them. While the game managed to have objectively impressive stats for its debut, it was clear that it did not quite live up to the successes of its predecessors. It certainly didn't help that plenty of other gacha games were becoming more popular, further contributing to players starting to feel fatigued having to keep up with so many at the same time, but regardless, it was clear Zenless Zone Zero had some problems. Not problems that could be fixed quickly, but rather ones embedded deep into the core design of the game which everything else was built upon. And so, over the past year, ZZZ was forced to make unprecedentedly significant changes, ultimately becoming a very different game compared to what it started as. This is the story of how Zenless Zone Zero sacrificed its unique vision in the pursuit of success. I suppose we should start from the very beginning though. On May 8th, 2022, a new Hoyo game was teased for the first time with this website.
A sub-hullo has suddenly appeared on the Janus Quarters August Street some 30 minutes ago.
On the left showed a calendar counting the days until May 13th, and the center had a staticky TV. All we knew was the title of the game and its app icon from Twitter. It was heavily theorized at the time that the genre would be first-person shooter, which is rather funny in retrospect because that obviously ended up being very off the mark. That doesn't count. On the 13th, the first trailer was uploaded to YouTube, where we finally got to see the game's fast-paced, hack-and-slash-esque action gameplay. Already, we were seeing the most unique character designs Hoyo had ever made for their playable characters, fluid and bouncy animation,
Zenless Zone Zero is going online! Tons of freebies are up for grabs!
higher graphical fidelity, and immaculate music taste. The video encouraged viewers to sign up for the game's tuning test or first closed beta that would be launching soon after. Obviously, there were a ton of things here that weren't ever intended to make it to the final game, but at the time, it wasn't known what would stick. I mean, for one, the gacha wasn't even implemented yet. An example was that all missions used to cost battery power, the game's time-gated energy system, and I think we're all glad that they chose to move away from that. As for my initial impressions of the game, I really enjoyed it on pretty much all aspects, but I was still a bit skeptical about recommending it to others. I'm gonna say now, straight up, not everyone is going to like this game. For once, something I said aged pretty well. It was immediately clear that the game was trying to appeal to players of roguelike games, which typically have a gameplay loop that entails entering a gauntlet of randomized battles with randomized events and modifiers. These games are praised for their high levels of replayability and on-the-fly customization, but using that formula as the main gameplay for a gacha business model had yet to prove successful. Zenless attempted to capture the roguelike essence through upgrades called Resonium, negative modifiers you'd accumulate by exploring called Corruptions, and gear coins that you could spend mid-run. You always had the option of choosing a riskier path to increase your strength, or staying safe but weaker overall. Unlike other gachas, this was not exclusive to a specific game mode, as it was active in even the most low-level basic missions. The roguelike elements were all facilitated via the TV segments, where you move along a grid and interact with various tiles. There was plenty of negative feedback about these portions being placed in between every fight, and though some figured it would just take time to get used to it, its overall effect on player perception and retention was much worse than we could have ever imagined. Fast forwarding over the other two closed beta tests because they pretty much just gradually transitioned toward the version we'd see on launch, Zenless Zone Zero released worldwide on July 4th, 2024. Hoyo went all out on the marketing, as we had received 36 promotional YouTube videos prior to release, including character teasers and demos, a pre-release special program, and a few music videos. They kept the momentum going with the first lore teaser dropping a few days after, foreshadowing the Void Hunters, the canonical strongest characters in universe. The developers clearly had a lot of confidence in their game, but how did the players feel? According to the data, they were losing interest fairly quickly. No matter how these statistics were measured, we can see that proportionally speaking, Star Rail made around 32% more revenue in its first month and Genshin 80%. The graphs tell a pretty clear story here. For Genshin, more players downloaded as word spread about it, and they continued to spend as they got more invested. Meanwhile, Zenless Zone Zero peaked right as it launched, with spending consistently decreasing as time went on. There were undoubtedly outside factors at play here, such as the pandemic ending, but it was still clear that something about this launch wasn't going as smoothly as it could have been. There were many areas of the game that had clear room for improvement, but the TV gameplay was evidently the most polarizing part of the entire game, with many being upfront about how it hurt the experience for them. Although its presence had been massively toned down from the first beta, with Resonium and Corruptions notably being relegated to the weekly Hollow Zero mode instead of all missions, in addition to less time spent on the TVs, that didn't do much to fix the fundamental reason behind why it was disliked. Although I enjoyed it more than most, even back then I could understand that it heavily interrupted the flow of gameplay. In roguelike games, it's common for there to be breaks in the action as you shop for upgrades and things of that nature, but you are always free to jump right back into the core gameplay as soon as you're ready. Zenless Zone Zero, on the other hand, basically split your game time in half between combat and navigating the TVs. It certainly didn't help that the game had to wait and load in between every single transition. Then there was also the additional padding of intro animations and stage clear animations, which although looked very nice, would be shown to you so often and further bloated the time spent transitioning. Another downside that wasn't as talked about was that the TV segments tended to drag down the combat portions with it. Skipping optional fights was practically encouraged, as they'd make it take significantly longer to complete a given mission. It made sense to have them when Resonium were still present, as fighting an enemy could potentially lead to your next fights being easier, but since those were gone, there was now much less purpose. It's somehow the opposite of Hoyo's general philosophy of further incentivizing you to engage with the game through bonus rewards. This would be the first of many examples of how changing one aspect of the game can trickle down to negatives in adjacent areas due to systems being built on top of each other. On paper, the idea of the TV mode might sound like it has no merit, so why were the developers so insistent on keeping it despite all of the negative feedback? Well, thematically speaking, it's perfect for the game. In ZZZ, you play as a proxy who can't enter the dangerous hollows yourself, but you are able to guide a team through it using your robot pet assistant called the Bang Boo. The TV segments mirror this while being stylistically on point, eliciting the feeling of being the hacker, a common movie trope in a game that is very upfront with its inspirations from movies. It also laid a foundation that was much easier to modify and randomize, as we'd see with the different game modes. And truthfully, they did put in a lot of effort into making the TV portions unique and interesting when possible. Chapter 3, the last of the story to be included in version 1.0, had us explore the Ballet Twins Hollow, and I felt that they really went all in on selling the idea of a haunted environment, making it feel completely different from the areas we went to before. Unlike in prior hollows where you could see everything, the lights were off, forcing you to illuminate light bulbs to see around you. There were also ghosts that could move you back, and you could deal with them by simply avoiding them or hitting them with your infrared camera flash. This simply wouldn't work without the TV mode, or at least it would take a lot more development resources while also being significantly less customizable. Version 1.1's Camellia Golden Week event also took the TV mode in a bit of a different direction, having a large single area that gradually opened up with mini games and combat segments scattered throughout. This included things like dodging incoming obstacles to the beat and your run-of-the-mill ice tile puzzles. Even if you didn't enjoy it, you had to admit that the devs were doing their best to innovate rather than just hoping everyone would start liking it. The version 1.2 special program seemed to corroborate these sentiments, as they optimized many of the animations to try and fix some of the pacing issues. It appeared like they would try and continue to make improvements on the existing formula. However, the tone took a hard pivot only a week later when a 30-minute dev face-to-face video was unexpectedly uploaded to YouTube. It should be noted that Hoyo has never done one of these with Genshin or Star Rail, as they typically leave any addresses to the community within special program live streams. The video being standalone indicated that the devs were serious about making change. I mean, Just look at this video description. This announcement included plenty of well-desired quality of life updates, such as backup battery charge for when you're at max energy, and being able to farm bosses beyond the hard 3 per week limit by using battery power, but the statement that everyone was talking about was that for 1.2 and beyond, the main story would not be including the TV mode at all. And to double down on it, Blitz Operation would be added to Hollow Zero, allowing players to collect their weekly bounty commissions without any interaction with the TV mode. Although they did state they would try to also add more enjoyable TV gameplay, the writing was on the wall. It was originally implemented because of its flexibility with unique storytelling opportunities, and if it wasn't going to be used for that, then what? Not having it be the main focus would also mean less incentive for the developers to continue working on it, leaving the players who enjoyed it concerned. The comments on this video are proof that there did exist at least some of an audience for this type of gameplay. However, Hoyo themselves have access to much more player data and feedback than we do, and it seemed like those things must have been indicating that the TV gameplay was nothing but a failure. It certainly caused players to leave, but would continuing to support it really keep those other players around? Oh, and also, 1.3 implemented the worst iteration of it that the game had ever seen for some reason. A YouTube walkthrough shows that the Mystery of Arpeggio Fault event takes almost 5 hours to complete, and there was not a single actual fight in it, but most players forced themselves to complete it because it had Night Boo as a part of its limited time rewards. Its gameplay had you recruit playable characters to follow you around, where they'd auto-battle enemies as you ran around collecting items and buying upgrades. That's it. I liked the TV mode plenty in its original form, and I have no idea who this event was appealing to. It only served to highlight the sluggish monotony of the mode at its worst, the complete opposite of the creative and interesting storytelling which made me like it in the first place. It seems like they had already decided that it would be phased out before this, but it certainly did not help the mode's reputation as it was on the way out. 1.4 marked the final nail in the coffin, as the TV sections, officially named Array Mode in-game, were retroactively removed from 1.0 story commissions. There was an optional toggle added to go back to them, and a handful of commissions couldn't be reworked to begin with, but this officially marked the end. Although they had promised to rework it in the past, it seems like the game has since moved on, with little to no hope of it coming back. We've had the new system for plenty of time now, where you solely navigate through the combat zone, and it comes with its own fair share of issues. There certainly are upsides, like no interruptions between combat segments and larger, more sprawling environments, but it's evident that so much was lost in the way of diversity and creative elements. I went back and played the updated final mission of Chapter 3 in the Ballet Twins, and the unique gameplay represented in the TV mode has no presence whatsoever. It's just fight after fight. The one thing that caught me off guard was the statue that would supposedly induce structural changes in the surrounding space. I didn't remember this part from the original version of the mission, so I was curious as to what would happen. It ended up turning the building upside down, which didn't have a single effect on gameplay, and might as well have not even been a sequence to begin with. We've since gotten new areas like the outer ring and the docks, and while they're visually stunning for sure, they don't feel any different to play, which is a real shame. The devs have attempted a few things to try and shake up the exploration aspect, but it's incredibly difficult to add anything meaningful. Every now and then they'll throw in a little fetch quest to distract you, or some kind of puzzle like this one. Occasionally they'll mix it up with some kind of new gameplay element for combat, like attacks coming from the sky that you can hide under cover to avoid or just straight up dodge, but with the telegraphing and how easy it is to avoid damage, it's fairly easy to ignore completely. Then there were times where they changed up the camera angles during combat, and while those were definitely fun to see, the gameplay itself was pretty much the same. The one time they attempted something radically different by adding in a motorbiking segment, it was cool, but its novelty wore off just as fast, and I have a feeling they were aware of that because it wasn't reused any time after. 2.0 includes some adjustments and additions to exploration, but I'm not sold yet. The perception techniques don't appear to be more than just stopping, pressing a button, and moving on like nothing happened. I do think they have and will continue to do a pretty decent job in terms of diversifying the types of enemies we'll encounter in different areas, but that only goes so far on its own. The new Lemnian Hollow is a larger, seemingly pre-made open area, which appears quite similar to what we got in 1.4's Into That Pale Wasteland event. While I thought the event was fairly unique and fun, it feels a little strange that it might be the main thing going forward. It's a big departure from how Hollows were originally described as constantly changing, playing into the randomized roguelike nature of the game. Yeah, it can be explained as each holo being different, but it really goes to show how drastically the nature of the game's entire creative direction has shifted. I'm sure there are players out there who much prefer the streamlined nature of what we currently have, but I can't shake the feeling that the game would have had so many more opportunities to build varied and dynamic yet highly cost-effective experiences if the TV mode was kept in. It was by no means a flawless system, but it had real strength that should have been worth exploring further. The decision to remove it was undoubtedly one of, if not the biggest gameplay change we'd ever seen in a Hoyo game, but it wasn't the only area Zenless Zone Zero felt the need to make improvements in. To be fair, Zenless got a lot right with its initial direction for combat. Characters, called agents in this game, are categorized by the premium tier S rank and the basic tier A ranks, and each one can equip a weapon called the W engine to get extra buffs. Each has skills for basic attacks, special attacks, dodges, assists, and ultimates, yet they all function very differently. You pull them from randomized rolls on the Gacha, which feature different banners every 3 weeks. To enter a mission, you form a party of 3 agents, which still heavily emphasizes team building, but puts a lot more focus on how you pilot each individual character. In that regard, I'm sure they took plenty of inspiration from Hoyo's biggest game before Genshin, Honkai Impact 3rd. So obviously I know HI3 exists, but at many points in this video I will continue to broadly reference Hoyo games, and that won't be including Honkai Impact. Not because I dislike it, just that I've barely played it, so it falls outside my area of expertise. Same applies to Tears of Themis, if any of you play that. Characters have a move list with plenty of intricacies to learn, making each one feel unique to play. The combo list might not be as complex as the fighting games, but having a good understanding of the agent you're playing certainly does go a long way in improving their performance. It also adds a big reason to enjoy using particular characters outside of their raw numbers. My favorite team to use is Chingy, Zhuyuan, and Nicole, who were all released very early on. With gacha games, it's fairly common for units to become obsolete in power, even within just a year, but somehow I keep finding myself going back to this team. I think the design of each of these agents says a lot about the level of care put into the game's combat direction. Chingy is a stun type unit who has a unique gauge that builds up when she deals electric damage, and it can be spent to do a special charge attack. The start of her basic combo deals physical damage, meaning that to play her optimally, you are ideally starting combos with a perfect dodge attack or an EX special attack, since they go straight into her electric damage loop. These mechanics directly reward good reactions and resource management. Like other stun agents, she deals high amounts of daze to enemies to set the team up for chain attacks. Zhuyuan is an attack type that is a shotgun with a limited amount of ether shells, so you want to ensure that when doing actions that reload them, such as ultimates, EX specials, and more, you aren't wasting any. She deals bonus damage to stunned enemies, making her a great follow-up to Qingyi. And lastly, we have Nicole, one of the free characters you get very early and a support type unit. She has incredible utility, being able to shoot a black hole that pulls in enemies in an area and increases their damage taken, making it very useful for both small enemies and large bosses. It also allows you to do a quick assist into Zhuyuan and further boosts ether damage, making the synergy for this lineup really strong. Because this is a team I've run since 1.1, I feel very comfortable using them, and I personally prefer to run them over other teams which may be considered stronger. For example, Trigger has the exact same categorization as Qingyi, being an electric stunner, but how they play couldn't be any more different. As opposed to Qingyi's heavy necessity for field time, Trigger just needs to quickly fill up a meter to launch follow-ups when your other agents attack. She's definitely a powerful stunner, but I simply don't have as much fun playing her. There are die-hard players out there who make it their life's mission to clear everything with Billy, the game's starting DPS, and it's genuinely impressive. Something like this doesn't happen unless your characters are both extremely likable and fun to play. Outside of the design of individual agents, the universal mechanics across all characters is another big factor in why people love the combat in this game. The pace is always kept fast thanks to how mobile everyone is. Move speed is high in general, but characters with abilities that would normally keep you locked in place can seamlessly reposition and dodge mid-combo, or otherwise ignore damage with invincibility frames. The movement makes it so chasing enemies down isn't that annoying, and you are always putting out damage thanks to being able to cancel pretty much any attack into a dodge. Then there's Anomaly, which introduces a whole other style of combat by executing consecutive anomaly disorders on enemies by stacking damage of the same element. Any agent can do them, but ones of the anomaly classification use it as their main form of damage. And lastly, there's the defense type, which doesn't have many characters, but can be plenty useful in keeping the team alive in game modes without a timer. The overall satisfaction with combat has always been quite high, which is why it came as a surprise when in the aforementioned dev face-to-face, They also announced that ultimate attacks would be completely reworked. We had gotten smaller adjustments before this, such as the lock-on function, manual chain attack activation and cancelling, and user interface adjustments, but this was a significantly bigger change. So each agent of course has their own resources to manage, with all of them having energy for enhanced special attacks and a bunch having their own unique gauges. Ultimates on the other hand cost 3000 decibels, which are generated through various combat actions, and these were shared across the 3 agents. This was notably very different from Hoyo's previous titles, which all kept ultimate charges individual. It seems like the design intention was to make players have to think a bit harder about who would be the one to use that limited resource, as opposed to simply popping each ultimate as soon as they came up. While an interesting idea in theory, in practice you'd pretty much only use it on your strongest attack type agent. They did seem to be aware that this could be an issue, so from the beginning, support ults were designed to provide extra energy to the team, and defense ults restored charges for defensive assists, but those were both resources you could acquire through other means. Losing DPS was practically never worth the utility, making the use of ultimates fairly one-dimensional, but nobody thought they'd just convert it to being separate charges. Because oftentimes in gachas, any general design problems that are discovered are not acknowledged outright, but are silently made sure to not be a problem with future characters from that point forward. In fact, the devs had already pretty much done that with how they had handled the additional abilities of each agent's core skill. Each agent gets a significant buff by having allies which fulfill their conditions, and early on this was them sharing their faction, or either their element or agent type. Similar to enemy elemental weaknesses, this is a blatant way to encourage players to get more characters and have more options which can bring out an agent's full potential. But even still, the faction restriction felt way out of place. Agents of the same faction aren't guaranteed to have synergy to begin with, and certain factions may never get new members, especially if they're no longer story relevant, which is why new characters starting from 1.3 no longer had it. Quick correction, Yanagi was the first, but after that it's been inconsistent, though it seems like newer S ranks don't have the restriction while A ranks do, which is just more top tier privilege I guess. So yeah, the ZZZ devs being transparent and admitting that the shared resource system for ultimates that they thought would be interesting was flawed was rather unexpected, even if it was a universal system that affected basically every playable character. However, the original intention to stop characters from mindlessly ulting as soon as it's ready in 99% of cases is pretty much exactly what ended up happening. They could have definitely made an attempt at compromising between the two styles, like increasing the utility and lowering the cost of non-attack ults to make it more balanced while remaining dynamic, but they went straight for the simple option that they knew nobody would complain about. I want to reiterate that the change was positive, but the original idea still had good intentions behind it, and it's kind of sad that the devs weren't able to try and make it work. However, the same cannot be said for character buffs, which are irrefutably a big positive change. In another developer video as a precursor to version 2.0, it was announced that Ellen, the game's first premium limited agent, would be receiving a direct upgrade to her existing kit to help her fare better against the other limited S ranks. Now this almost didn't feel real with how unexpected it was. I mean, gachas by nature encourage power creep, constantly releasing stronger characters to keep players pulling on banners, and if they do want to buff an existing fan favorite, they typically do so indirectly with a synergistic dedicated support that you also have to pull for. The monetary incentives for these practices are so incredibly high, so how is it possible we were getting direct character buffs this early into the game's lifespan? Zenless Zone Zero gives its playable characters very special treatment, and the community matches that energy by drawing explicit images of them. Yeah, the character designs and models are significantly more suggestive than other Hoyo games, despite them all sharing the same T for teen rating. Like Trigger, where's your shirt? That can't be comfortable. And look at these profile banners you get for getting max duplicates on an agent. Kinda makes me think that the cover-ups they did on the old beta models didn't need to happen, but it is what it is. While Genshin and Star Rail have effectively stopped making their respective hangout events and companion quests, Zenless continues to include invitation events and trust commissions for every new character as an extra addition to their spotlight in the main story, events, and individual agent missions. That is, if you pull for them. The amount of content unlocked by owning an agent is kind of a lot actually. Each one has all kinds of unique animations, with completely separate walk cycles in the overworld to reflect being in a calmer environment. They can pop up in random events, you can take a walk with them, and building up trust to max unlocks their wallpaper for your menu screen. How a character plays in combat is generally what players will want to pull for, but the heavy emphasis on characterization makes it not that far behind. Seriously, some of these situations they put in the game are completely absurd, but clearly players enjoy it. This dedication to its playable characters is one of the things that sets ZZZ apart from Hoyo's other titles, and that certainly seems to be the reason the devs have been so quick to do the things the other games have been reluctant to. Alternate outfits are something each community has begged for several times over, but Genshins are sparse and star rails are nearly non-existent. Meanwhile, Zenless introduced them in 1.5, and instead of making them for characters who released a few years ago, they are actually synced up with agent debuts. That way, if you prefer the alternate look, you never even have to use the original to begin with. They have also made free outfits for the protagonists in the theme of the new city with customizable accessories, which again was a very pleasant surprise that undoubtedly made players of other gacha games very jealous. On a similar note, Ellen is getting a direct buff because her base kit was in a pretty bad spot. Again, there were people committed to making her work, but she is objectively much harder to pilot relative to other characters without very much in the way of positives to make herself stand out. Her attacks become enhanced with ice damage after doing her special sprint into charge attack combo, but this can feel slow to pull off, especially when there aren't attacks for you to dodge from, and the usages get expended very quickly. In general, her attacks and combos take a long time to get going, which feels bad when other characters are snappier and can tag out easier. Giving her more attacks in her combos lets her do more damage and have more options to choose from, and she now gets invincibility frames on her charge attacks so she isn't so vulnerable, making it so hitting a counter speeds up the charge, also maintains that original design of anticipating attacks to optimize your damage, which is great because it shows a commitment to the original distinct playstyle. It's unclear how often other agents will get buffs because I feel that Ellen was particularly in a bad spot, whereas the other early S ranks can keep up fairly well still, especially with indirect buffs remaining as an option. Still though, having the first instance of buffs so early reflects well on the devs for sure, but it's also a smart move for them financially, as her outdated gameplay could have been a potential reason to not pull for her on her next rerun to some. It also helps that she has a paid outfit, which is low-key a bit of a scam, considering that in the same update they showed a significantly improved version of the same relatively simple design. I mean, they already had this one in the game since launch, so they figured they might as well charge for it, but it's a little hard to ignore how basic it is compared to the other alternate outfits, while also being of the highest rank. I still like it though. The characters are the lifeblood of any gacha game of course, but Zenless especially takes pride in how it presents its agents, fleshing out their character at any opportunity possible. This has always been the intention of the devs, as evidenced by user customization centered around them like its merchandise, but was further expanded by being able to walk around as them from 1.4, trust invite dialogues being gradually upgraded to quality time variants where you walk around the city with them, and in 2.0 we can even take them to the movies. They also just upgraded the agent menu animations with extra VFX, and I never even noticed they were missing before this. A quintessential example of how these systems work together to make characters more interesting can be found in the most popular agent to date, Miyabi. She was present in the betas, but wasn't made fully playable until all the way in 1.4. I know some people thought her original model was cute in its own way, but her updated design looks much better while retaining all the important details. Overall, she's presented in a very serious way, especially in the cutscenes that show off her strength, but you also get to see a much goofier side of her in her daily life. Having her height listed with ears included is super memorable, though that's more so the devs throwing in a good joke. But in the game's messenger, Miyabi uses her ID portrait as her profile picture, whereas everyone else uses a cool art of themselves or something they're interested in. She also sleepwalks in the middle of the city, really likes to eat melons, and considers everything to be a form of training. I'm not going to try and act like she's the most complex character ever written, but the many systems built into the game do a lot to make each agent much more interesting to interact with. On a more personal note, I think Zenless Zone Zero does the best job of any Hoyo game when it comes to visual storytelling through design. While this game's designs aren't immune to some of the trademark Hoyoverse specials, like excessive asymmetry, jackets where the sleeves are optional, and thigh accessories, each playable faction has a clearly distinct visual identity. People are still begging for the idol faction to this day, carried by their designs and concept alone. Of all of Zenless's changes over the past year, the one thing that feels like it's never compromised on quality with is its agents, both in making them feel uniquely powerful to play and making their characters likable while ensuring each has plenty of screen time. Agents are included in content at any opportunity. Having them in things like limited events is pretty standard practice for gachas, but even the most throwaway events do their best to inject in as much of their unique personalities as possible, And then you even get them in smaller moments, like almost the entirety of the male roster assembling during one of Hugo's random trust events. This example is pretty emblematic of Zenless's commitment to immersion and is heavily aided by the game's smaller scope. The story so far certainly isn't without its problems, but still, I find ZZZ's story to be the most engaging out of Hoyo's titles, in large part because everything feels well connected. That's the advantage of having the story take place within the single city of New Eridu, rather than traveling across entire nations or planets. That's not to say that the story doesn't amp up the stakes every now and then to make for tense, exciting moments, but not always having a giant threat looming overhead allows for the slice of life portions of the game to have room to breathe and never feel out of place. It also makes the interweaving of character stories much more believable, with things like Juyuan from Public Security and Miyabi from Section 6 being past classmates, and it actually being referenced again instead of just being a throwaway comment. Even outside of just the playable characters, New Eridu is built to feel like people actually live there. The NPCs that run the stores have such memorable designs, and they're involved in content much more than you'd expect. Going to Bardic Needle is how you recycle your agent's equipment in-game, but it's presented as if you're walking into a record store. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal, but the little details somehow often end up being some of the most memorable. And hey, we can even take NPCs to the movies with us, which is something I could have never imagined being possible. But even outside of the recurring NPCs, the ones that are meant to be extras are also really good. Of course, they still rely on mixing and matching presets, and they obviously don't look as good as the playable characters, but they look clean enough to reasonably fit in without feeling out of place side by side. The commitment to immersion has always been one of Zenless's strongest points, but this actually is also something that the devs felt like they needed to compromise on. From the start, it was always quite an interesting decision to make the protagonist Wise or Belt not able to fight. This is a heavy contrast to Genshin and Star Rail, which let you fight as the protagonist and use that to facilitate story beats. But the way this is explained in the story makes it feel really natural. Hollows are the game's dangerous areas, and they corrupt people who stay in them for too long. The twins are a legendary proxy duo who used to operate under the name Phaethon, and their job is to help agents with higher ether aptitude navigate through the hollow from the outside. This is a very solid premise, providing strong reasoning for the distinction in gameplay between the TV segments and the combat segments. But since the TV navigation is removed, that throws a wrench in everything, because now the gameplay of running around the hollows as your agent hardly feels like it necessitates your protagonist telling them where to go. They basically got reduced to saying, okay, you can go ahead to the next area now, rather than solving logistical problems within the mission. I'm going to talk about the recent story progression for a bit, so if you haven't played 1.6 and 7 Season 1 Epilogue yet, I'll leave a chapter marker for you to skip to. But with that out of the way, I'm not surprised the twins have extra powers, because it's always been hinted that they're special with their ability to sync with Eos, and they have a tragic but relevant backstory. However, I'm not the hugest fan of them getting ether aptitude over a Wi-Fi update. Like, maybe if we knew beforehand that they have some kind of anti-corruption healing ability, then it would make sense to bring them into the hollow. But we didn't, so what was the point of bringing them when they can't defend themselves and would just be a liability? Like, their first task is to do some techie stuff, but being remote has never been an issue for them before, so it now just feels very shoehorned. Like, the only reason Vivian got hit was because she was trying to protect us, which shouldn't have even happened in the first place. At least with Astra's concert, it made sense that we wanted to watch it. To me, this reads as the writers trying their best to work around the fact that the protagonist has to be included somewhere, but narratively, they don't have a clear role anymore. And then by extension, Fairy is completely homeless from a story perspective. Previously, she was the mysterious superpowered AI that could solve any issue, making for a good supporting character in the TV segments. In the Ballet Twins part I mentioned earlier, Fairy provides us with the infrared camera to get rid of ghosts, but it's up to us to use it to navigate the hollows. This is a clear example of Fairy and the protagonist having distinct but codependent narrative roles. However, since the TV segments are now gone, her presence has been diminished more and more, which is crazy considering how she's set up to be a major part of the overarching plotline. There were plenty of memorable interactions between the twins and Fairy, but without a means to facilitate that kind of thing, they end up fighting over the same general role of navigator, where of course the protagonists are going to be prioritized. Her ability to collect bonus rewards from missions has recently been expanded so you can spend power cards to not even have to complete the missions the first time, so I mean, it's not like the devs completely forgot about her existence, but it remains to be seen if she'll continue to be as story relevant as before. This is a prime example of how gameplay changes can have huge implications on the rest of the game. However, I can't say this development was completely unexpected, because the rest of the game's immersive systems have continuously been depreciated since launch. Now don't get me wrong, some of them were evidently far too ambitious for their own good. Up until 1.2, the game's time of day system was completely rigid. It passed one phase by doing pretty much any activity or sleeping, but you could only do that once per day. This made specific timed events pretty inconvenient to get to, and made it even worse if you accidentally skipped over one. Cynically, you could say this was to maximize player engagement, but people ended up just completing the fastest mission to get around it, and we got the ability to select the time of day not too long after, so I really just think the devs believed it was a neat idea to make it feel like you're a part of the world. Plenty of other adjustments fit this same style, such as Coffee Cafe now only having 2 types of coffee. You either choose the one for farming materials, or the one that gives you 20 more battery power, but prior to 1.4 there were 22 different types that showed up on rotation. Now I get it, having the daily selection made it awkward to farm specific materials for specific characters, but having to peruse through the different options felt like I was picking out from the menu of a real coffee shop. Having it condensed to 2 nearly identical options was certainly a convenient change, but it does lose that one little extra touch of character it brought to the game's world, and it's also a shame that these old assets are now completely unused. Then we have the ability to switch characters in the overworld. As I mentioned earlier, the animations are amazing, especially if you're one of those players. Never forget when the camera transparency was broken and there were riots over it. But switching was clearly not intended to be added to the game, as they even said that when implementing it, they realized Ben is built too large to even fit through the door of the video store. I totally understand why people wanted this feature, and it allows for the flexibility to do a lot more, such as switching point of view, but it's yet another example of the devs folding on something they had previously committed to. In 2.0, they've also announced that the HDD will no longer be needed to access missions, but I've honestly never thought that it was that inconvenient to fast travel to the HDD and interact with it. Normally, these quality of life updates are welcome because they're intended to make the act of playing the game more seamless and less frustrating, but each time, the game's experience changes ever so slightly. It would be disingenuous to act like this is happening everywhere, as things like the various forms of storytelling and overall style are largely untouched, grounding the game in something familiar no matter how much everything else changes over time. I know cutting out the fluff was done with good intentions, but that fluff was originally added for a reason. It always feels conflicting because, of course, the devs should listen to the feedback of the people playing their game, but they should also have confidence in their ideas and be able to strike a balance for their own sakes. It's incredibly interesting how there's a handful of implemented mechanics in the game that serve little to no purpose but still are yet to be removed. These didn't quite fit in anywhere else in the video, so I'll just go through them now. Our first example is found within the store promoter system. Every day you can select a character to promote the video store, and the next day they'll have bonus rewards, which for playable characters is elemental upgrade materials. Each promoter has a happiness rating, which seems to suggest they'll get upset if you put them on shift too much, but nothing actually ends up happening. There are some screenshots of the mood going down to calm, but there doesn't seem to be any real effect. Similarly, if you open the agent stats, you can see an extra categorization for damage that the game never explains anywhere. All agents, even newer ones, fall under slash, strike, or pierce based on the weapons they fight with. In the first beta, this is what was used to categorize each agent's upgrade materials, because anomaly, stun, and so on didn't exist yet. Slash was effective against ethereals, strike was effective against mechanical enemies, and pierce was effective against humanoid enemies. These tags for enemies do still exist and can be found in the databank, however this type system was entirely replaced by elemental weaknesses, leaving damage types with no clear purpose. Even distinctions like which characters can deflect bullets are not consistent with the slash category of agents. At the end of missions, we get these agent ratings, which we don't know how they're calculated. They're probably more confusing than helpful, in my opinion. Oh, and I almost forgot, this game used to have co-op. Not like the little party minigames from events. Real, synchronized co-op combat. It was fully implemented in the betas for weekly bosses, yet was strangely absent from 1.0. We thought it was going to take a few updates for it to be finalized and released, but obviously that never happened. To be fair, it wasn't anything groundbreaking, so I personally don't think we're missing out on that much, but there definitely are people out there who would have enjoyed this being in the game. It's rather odd that it was completely removed despite how much effort had seemingly already been put into it. And my last example is a bit different in nature, but is also in my opinion the most interesting. So back when I was given access to the first beta, one of the things that content creators were asked to showcase was Nicole's secret motion input. If you didn't know, doing a 360 motion during her EX special has 2 unique animations, which aren't written in her move list. The hitbox timings are a little different from the regular activation, but using it was never really a big deal to begin with. I always thought this was really cool because it added another layer of mastery to piloting different characters and added a bit of direct mechanical skill expression that is often completely absent from gacha games. Well, as far as I know, they've never done anything like this ever again. We do have agents in the game that tend to be on the more complicated side in terms of their combos and execution, so it's not like they change their direction when it comes to agent design, but I must admit I am just a tiny bit disappointed we weren't blessed with more little details like this. This handful of examples of leftover mechanics serves as even more proof that this game has had some kind of friction present during its development. Obviously, none of these have that strong of a bearing on the game's overall quality, but I don't recall ever seeing such indecisiveness when it comes to mechanics in Genshin or Star Rail, so it's very intriguing that Zenless has multiple instances of it. Given the fairly harsh stance that I've taken in this video, I should clarify that I still really enjoy playing Zenless Zone Zero, even in its current iteration. If I truly disliked the game after all its changes, I wouldn't still be playing it, and I probably wouldn't have made this video. Since I've made clear my many criticisms, I think it's only fair that I also acknowledge the positive changes that have kept me playing. Zenless is pretty generous all things considered. Yeah, I'm aware that it's a calculated risk for them to keep us happy, but objectively, we have gotten a lot of stuff. The S-Rank Harumasa was given to everyone for free during 1.4's soft reboot, and sure, it might have been because everyone was going to spend on Miyabi anyway, but a character is a character. The anniversary rewards are generally agreed upon to be good, with 30 pulls, a free standard pool S-Rank character, and an S-Rank W engine, so hopefully Google Classroom doesn't get review bombed for once. They even gave out daily polychromes to celebrate the end of Season 1, which nobody would have complained about if they didn't do. And when it comes to endgame, there are the typical patterns of HP inflation, modifiers targeting the newest agents, and arbitrary type weaknesses, but anecdotally, I've been able to clear almost every phase just pulling for characters I like and without signature W engines. I imagine if I actually spent more time building better sets and making less execution mistakes, I'd have no problems. Speaking of endgame, it refreshes once every week, alternating between its two modes, Shiryu Defense and Deadly Assault. That's pretty surprising considering Star Rail's 3 modes combine to rotate every 2 weeks or 6 weeks for each individual game mode, and Genshin's 2 modes each refresh once a month, making for an average wait time of a little over 2 weeks. It's a pleasant surprise every time I open the game and see there's a new challenge up because I'm so used to having to wait much longer in between refreshes. More stages also equates to, of course, more rewards. Not that much because though Shiryu Defense gives a total of 720 polychromes every cycle, Deadly Assault only gives a max of 300. Speaking of Deadly Assault, it was added in 1.4 and makes for a pretty interesting addition with its unique approach to scoring combat. Unlike Shiryu Defense, which is your standard defeat every enemy within the time limit, Deadly Assault gives you a score based on how much damage you deal to a single boss within 3 minutes. And not only that, there's other conditions which you can activate to get bonus points. This includes general mechanics such as executing perfect dodges or triggering perfect assists, and boss-specific ones like impairing a boss by breaking their legs or interrupting their standby phase. This system heavily rewards you for being able to identify parallel objectives and executing accordingly on your game plan. There are 3 separate stages in which you can repeat characters, which is fairly demanding, but you can obtain all of the polychrome rewards just by getting 6 out of 9 stars, making it pretty fair. Overall, a great addition to the game. The battle tower isn't quite as memorable, but is also complementary to the other combat-based modes. It was first implemented in 1.3 with its simulated battle trial. This has you take on 5 floors in a row, with your agent health not regenerating across them. This uniquely raises the value of having a defensive character on your team, especially because this mode does not have a timer counting down. Defense types are inherently not quite as generally useful as the other classes, supported by them having the least amount of agents in the game, but it's nice they do have a place where they can shine. After 25 floors, there's an endless gauntlet where you can try to see how far you can get. There's no rewards tied to it, but for those who really want to test the limits of their skills and or their willed out characters, it's cool that it exists. The second Battle Tower mode, Battle Trial Last Stand, was added in 1.5 and operates fairly similarly. The rewards are heavily front-loaded again, so that even casual players can get all of the important stuff, but the challenge is there for those who seek it. It also refreshes its stages, albeit very slowly. Building your characters in gacha games always tends to be one of the worst parts of the entire experience, and while unfortunately there's no auto farm, outside of that, they do a lot of things to make things a bit easier for us. For one, having direct shortcuts between the material stages and upgrade menus makes things really easy to follow. The act of repeating stages to farm the materials does tend to get boring, which is kind of inevitable, but when it comes to the most dreaded part of building a character, the randomized slotted equipment pieces that are called drive discs in this game, you have a few different means of collecting them. You have your standard routine cleanup stages which drop drive discs in pairs of sets, but by doing your weekly bounty commissions, you get these free Victoria housekeeping coupons that drop a whole run's worth of items instantly. These were added in 1.4 and are really convenient. Furthermore, dismantling unwanted drive discs gives a resource called master copies, which can be converted into more drive discs. Picking the set is free, but you can select a specific slot for an increased price, and additionally select the main stat with the tuning calibrator item, usually given out during limited time events. You get S-rank master copies from completing endgame modes, but even the A-rank ones given from dismantling are plenty useful because they have a chance to roll into an S-rank drive disc. This, combined with your set bonuses not being tied to specific pieces for a little bit of flexibility, means that building agents is relatively easy to do. Oh, and also, disc upgrade materials are farmable on their own, cutting out the middle steps of having to farm, then decide which ones are worth keeping and which aren't, and then break them down. Not sure why the other games don't have this as well. Ultimately, the system is still meant to maximize playtime by having you chase those perfect substats, but in terms of getting a new character started with baseline solid equipment, Zenless makes it a fairly harmless experience. I know I've talked pretty negatively about many of the quality of life adjustments to the game, but stuff like navigating the world map has always bothered me. It only got worse as more areas were added, making it increasingly inconvenient to scroll through, which is why scrapping it completely for a world map is a very welcome change. It has the bonus of world building since we now know where each area is relative to each other, but they actually ended up making a good compromise by leaving the old system separate while also significantly improving its layout. Both systems have their individual strengths, and each player is free to use whichever they want at any time. If playing Pokemon TCG Pocket has taught me anything, it's that having a good user interface with good interaction often goes unnoticed until you see one that's particularly bad, so we need to appreciate it more when it's good. Without question, Zenless is already miles ahead of every other game because they actually have a pity counter instead of forcing you to scroll through your pull history every time there's a new banner. They also allow you to turn off damage numbers in combat, which helps a lot with visual clarity, especially against waves of smaller enemies. But with the many things discussed at the end of the 2.0 special program, they clearly put a lot of thought into things that I probably wouldn't have even noticed otherwise. They even went out of their way to improve additional things like freeing up storage on segments you're never ever going to play again, and letting any A rank be purchasable from the shop, rather than having a specific outdated rotation. The devs clearly have put in a lot of care into improving the game as much as they can, and even if I don't agree with how some of their decisions were handled, the nature of their work very much reflects on their good intentions. Zenless Zone Zero is Hoyoverse's most interesting release to date, at least with regards to how they've treated it post-launch. 2.0 appears to have been a huge commercial success, and while that certainly can be attributed to a new, cool-looking powerful agent, plus the rerun of a super meta support and reset top-up bonuses, players are generally very happy with the state of the game and its content. At least in my region, the app ratings reflect that. In a way, it's kind of inspiring to know that even with a well-experienced and well-funded studio, the developers were willing to be upfront about admitting their mistakes and how they'll work towards making a better product. Gacha games tend to have a negative stigma by default, which is pretty fair considering how many incidents have happened, and that's why I'm glad that more regulations are being put in place, so that hopefully the people spending the most money on these games and keeping them funded are those who have the expendable income available and the financial literacy to spend responsibly. Because behind the microtransactions and daily retention systems, there exists plenty of well thought out game design, stunning visuals, and genuinely good gameplay. But as much as I'd like to close the video there, we don't actually know how the Zenless Zone Zero developers truly feel deep down about the changes they've made. Like I said, TV mode was controversial from the very beginning, yet they were confident enough to stick with it through years of betas and up to 1.2. Was it because they knew how much of a time sink it would be to change such an integral part of the game, or was it because it wasn't until the financial pressure set in that they realized they would have to appeal to the largest audience possible, sacrificing their original vision? Based on an interview with the game's director a year before launch, I'm inclined to believe that it might be closer to the latter. Zhenyu Li heavily emphasized the focus on roguelike elements, choosing to implement them because of his own love for the genre. He even stated that he didn't think the gacha made much of a difference, supporting the idea that to him, it's always primarily just been the business model that keeps the game funded. Maybe it is really naive of me to take his word at face value, because realistically, what else would he have responded to this question with? But at the same time, Zenless Zone Zero offers a lot of content while being available on any modern gaming device, and also letting you experience a large majority of the game for completely free. Then he mentions the rogue elements again, despite them being a relatively small part of what the game is now. There have been many updates to the weekly farming content, transitioning from Withered Domain to Lost Void, which retains the roguelike gameplay while foregoing the TV segments. Admittedly, they still pay a lot of attention to this mode, making sure there's always rewards to aim for, and implementing tons of new mechanics, such as the unique character abilities that likely played a huge role in Ellen getting her buffs. In 2.0, they're adding more ways to shake up combat with tag assists, a new mode, extra missions, and more options for agent augments, which I have to acknowledge is amazing, even if I find the exploration aspect of it to be very lackluster. But just like its roguelike mode predecessors, Lost Void is relegated to a side game mode that exists among plenty of others. A far cry from being the main focus like what was once the goal. The original design continues to leave footprints on the game's current content, like with how weekly bosses still have you select a Resonium, despite them not being necessary at all to clear the stages. So on the one hand, you could interpret Zenless Zone Zero's changes in growth as an example of devs that listen to feedback and maintain strong communication, but you can just as easily see it as giving up on the original vision for the sake of appealing to the casual audience in order to keep the game alive. Unfortunately, that is just the cutthroat nature of gacha games, especially when it comes to the high budgets of ones in the modern era. Although the potential success they can achieve is unbelievably high, they are all competing for the same limited amounts of time and money from players, and if they're not doing well enough, the servers, and subsequently your ability to play, can be gone before you know it. I can't even imagine how terrible it must feel as a developer to have your efforts be wasted like that. Maybe in another universe, the devs would have been more stubborn, keeping that original spirit of the game alive, and eventually have been rewarded for it. But perhaps that's a bit too idealistic, and we were always destined to end up here no matter what. I can only hope that the devs will continue to work with the same level of passion and dedication, despite how many adversities they faced.
大家好，我是振宇，好久不见，不知不觉绝区零马上就要1周年了。首先祝各位神将周年快乐，很感谢大家在这1年中的陪伴和支持。到这里，其实我有些话想跟大家分享。1.0 版本上线以来，绝区零经历过风波，也取得过一些成绩，多亏大家一路以来的支持，真的很感谢陪伴着我们的所有神将们，感谢大家的支持，祝各位神将周年快乐。
This was the story of Zenless Zone Zero and how it changed everything.